from Black Swan Textiles. I've known Keith for several years, not counting how many. And I think we'll all find this very interesting. I know that he's had a very interesting career path, and he's doing some really interesting things now. Keith has always been on the forefront of technology and pushing innovation in our industry. So without further ado, hi, Keith.
Hey, how you doing, Mitch? Happy Bistro
Great.
Day.
Yeah, we're going to break out soon. So the first question, and for Keith, this is actually, I think, a really interesting question about his career path and how he's gotten here, because I think that a lot of what he's done over the years with innovation and technology has really kind of pushed the envelope, pushed the industries farther, and it really kind of informs what he's doing today. So without further ado, I ask you, Keith, how'd you get here?
A long path. I went to college. I was an art major, and I drew pictures. And my first job out of college was in Green Bay, Wisconsin. There used to be a department store called Prangies. It was a regional department store, and they advertised in the newspaper. So I drew fashion illustrations for newspaper ads for them, and you know, nobody wants to be stuck in Green Bay. Well, some people love Green Bay. It's a wonderful place, but it's not really the happening place for art. So I eventually moved on to illustrate for a store in Cincinnati, Ohio called Pogues, and then I made it out to New Jersey and drew for a store called Hanes, H-A-H-N-E-S in beautiful Newark. And then moved to New York and started freelancing. And I drew for a lot of stores, Brooks Brothers, Gray Advertising. And then I took a gig illustrating for Ralph Lauren, and then went on staff as a art director for Gentleman's Clothing. And you know, I took that job because it was relatively easy. You know, when I was freelancing, I was doing 3 all-nighters a week at least. You know, I thought I'd left that behind in college, but little did I know. But you know, Ralph was a good place to work because strong brand point of view, you know, emphasis on quality, beautiful headquarters, and I worked there probably with some of the most talented, you know, most talented group of illustrators I've seen, and that was a joy. And one of the things that they emphasized was, in order to evaluate a design, and we illustrated upcoming designs, they had to be super realistic and they had to be color correct. And this is all hand rendered stuff. This is before Illustrator and Photoshop. So we experimented a lot of different ways to match colors, anything from overlapping coats of magic markers to mixing inks and this kind of stuff. And finally, Ralph had opened an R&D facility in North Carolina. This was in the early 90s when the textile industry was starting to move away. And so they hired a bunch of industry veterans to work in a facility in Greensboro and do finish development and product development and color development. So these were guys that had worked in textiles all their lives. So I visited Greensboro just to see how they managed color. And a guy named Ben Bell, who had been working in digital color since literally before I was born. You know, he was working when spectrophotometers were the size of a room. He was involved in that. And he started explaining LAB and all this stuff. And I said, why are you spelling out lab? I have no idea what he's talking about. But as he explained the science of color, it kind of corresponded to what I just kind of done intuitively. You know, I had taken color theory in college and complementary colors and all this kind of crap, but never really thought of it in terms of hue, lightness, chromaticity, and you know, the numbers that correlate to that. So, you know, I learned what they did and took some of their technology to improve what we were doing in New York. But then the opportunity came about to actually move to Greensboro. And at the time, you know, married at a young daughter, and I didn't really want her to grow up thinking that was normal. So I took advantage of the chance to move down to Greensboro and set up R&D with Ben Bell. We set up our own color lab, and I mean we were matching colors that were set down on inspiration swatches from New York, and we distributed these color standards to the mills all around the world, and we evaluated lab dips for men's knits. And so when I came down there, I had never done this before in my life. And Ben, you know, he had been doing it for years. He had the perfect eye, and he could make color corrections, visually on colors that we were trying to match, and he could make great comments on color difference for the lab dips. And then I started looking at the software using Data Color Chroma QC at the time, and I started looking at the numbers that were associated with it, and so I would measure all the lab dips, and he would comment on them. So I started looking at correlation between, okay, what do the numbers say and what does he say? And all of a sudden, I kind of figured it out. And so he said, Keith, why don't you start making corrections on these color matches we're trying to do? So I started using the correction software from Data Color and got a pretty good hit rate. And so we started adopting it, and then we started looking at loading. I mean, one thing about Ralph Lauren, their colors, they're known for their colors, and they're known for deep, rich colors that kind of push the edge of feasibility. You're loading as much dye onto that substrate as you possibly can while you're trying to maintain your fastness requirements. So we worked with mills in region. There were still mills making fabric for Ralph Lauren products in North Carolina and Tennessee and that region. So it was a good immersion into the industry. So I made that switch from the creative side to the actual production, and I started to see that there were concerns at the mill that had to do with manufacturing, and could be perceived by design as, oh, those crazy mills know what they're doing. But the fact of the matter is that usually the mills did. So I spent about 10 years at Ralph Lauren, and then I ventured off to work at Fruit of the Loom, where I was the grapes for a while. And no, actually I oversaw their domestic dye houses. Imagine domestic dye houses. And traveled all over the US looking at them and looking at processes, and not just color, but you start to look at other implications of color. There was, their policy up until that point was to buy the cheapest dyes that they possibly could, and they would invite all the dye stuff vendors in to Jamestown, where the purchasing office was, and they would just beat these guys and just beat them down on price. And we looked at their, other than white, one of the colors that Fruit of the Loom ran was this navy color, and they were running 20% seconds on navy, and in a mill that's brutal. I mean, you're running on a small margin, and to lose 20% of your goods due to shade is bad. So we were working with Clarion at the time, and they introduced a new line of dyes that had properties to them that were more forgiving in, to put up with stuff that happened in the mill. So we ran a trial and matched that shade with these new dyes, and all of a sudden, without changing anything but the dyes, we cut our seconds down to 2%. Now, we doubled our dye cost, but dye cost was minimal at that time, and you're saving a lot more money by reducing your off shade goods than you are by spending on increased dyes. So that was an introduction into color's not just red, green, yellow, blue. It's the dyes and chemicals and the dyeing procedures that go into that. And we had 5 dye houses at the time, and each one of them was challenged with different problems. So we came up with this program called Adopt a Mill, and we invited each of the major dye stuff suppliers to come and basically adopt a mill. You can take over the dye house in this facility for 6 months. You can implement your processes, your dyes, your chemicals, and then we're going to evaluate your rate of improvement after those 6 months. And so it was implemented with the global CEO of DyeStar came in back before it was DyeStar. But anyway, he came in from Germany, and we're sitting around this room, and he's thinking this is great opportunity. And I leave the office thinking, all right, good plan. Get back to my office. My boss's boss come in and says, sorry, you're laid off. And Fruit Loop went bankrupt. But it was one of those ideas that kind of stuck with me. I said, why don't we bring in the expertise of guys who have a stake in dyeing and finishing, guys who sell products to mills. So from Fruit Loom, I went to Target. Target, big box store. 90% of their apparel is own brand, so it's designed and developed just like it is at Ralph Lauren or PVH or anybody else. So at that time, it was in the heyday of lab dips. And my boss, Anton Wilson, had just kind of taken a chance talking data color, and they had bought spectrophotometers, and they were looking at this program called Image Master that was kind of on-screen color. And he basically said, okay, set up a program. We're getting killed here with all these lab dips. So we started looking at the technology, and at the time, a QTX file, spectral data, was really, other than outside of the mills, it wasn't known. Nobody talked about spectral data at the brands. So, having worked at Polo and at Fruit Loom, we started exploring, okay, what if we receive a lab dip, evaluate it, and then send the comments back to the mill with the spectral data and our comments for what we see. And so that kind of took off. It replaced faxing the results out. So we actually emailed the spectral data. And then I was on a phone one day with a guy named Brad McClanahan from Clariant, who had been our account rep at Ralph Lauren. And he was responsible for providing us with dyes and stuff. And I said, Brad, I didn't know how good I had it at Ralph. I mean, we made our own standards. We can control our own destiny. And here I am at Target, and what are we using for standards? And at the time, I won't even say what they were using, but they were using some of the commercially available standards in the industry. And there were a couple suppliers of that. But I remember one day I got a visit from a dye house manager from Singapore. He had gotten on a plane and flew to Minneapolis just to dispute a lab dip rejection. And he said, are you kidding me? This is a perfect match. And you guys saying it's too green. So he pulls out his standard, pulls out his lab dip. We go to the light box. We pull out our standard. His standard is gray. Our standard is green. And it's the same product number. And he's just furious. And so having been in the dye house, I understood his point of view. And when the one thing I learned from Ben was, if the numbers don't make sense, there's usually a reason, and it's either somebody's colorblind, or you got a bad standard, or you're using the wrong light source. So sure enough, so I told Brad, I said, why didn't Clariant start up a color standard business? And shortly thereafter, a Chroma was born, and guys like Doug Bynum, who was on your last session, and that crew, brought about this idea of a certified color standard, one that could be relied on, not just as a visual thing, but the data, the underlying data, the spectral data was actually a standard. The physical swatch was just kind of an actor portraying that data. And so using that, we implemented digital color matching, digital color with all the target vendors. And all of a sudden, they had to go from free references that they had in their swatch books to they had to buy color standards from our chroma, and they were $10 a piece. And oh man, for the first couple months, these guys came. There were vendor meetings, and certain countries, the dye houses were more. The dye house managers were more vocal, and they were screaming bloody murder. How I've got to pay $10 for a standard. But then we started tracking results, and all
I know that guy.
yeah, I know. All of a sudden, they were getting approved on the first round rather than the third, and they started calculating their courier costs, if nothing else, and they quickly shut up. So to me, that was a program will be successful if it's successful with the mills, and they saw that as a win for them. So we had at Target, we had 7 color offices around the world, and when I started there, the remote color offices were basically screening offices. They would receive the lab dips from the local mills. They would look at them, figure out which they thought was the best. They'd measure it, and then they'd send it to us. And we would get to letter AA, BB, CC, 50 lab dips later, and we're still not approved. So then okay, forget the screening stuff, measure everything. And what we found was people in general do a bad job of screening. I mean, it's not, there wasn't anyone particular, it's a subjective thing. So if we can convert a color to numbers, let's look at all the colors. And what we found was generally the best shots were within the first 3 rounds. If you went past 3 rounds, there was something wrong. And so we changed from screening, and then we basically said, you guys approve yourself. You don't need to send it to Minneapolis to make a decision. Our biggest concern was what they said if they rejected, because we gave them tolerances on what they had to approve. And if it's off shade, there's three components. It's either hue, lightness, or chromaticity. And when people say it's too bubblegummy or it's not what's in my head, that's not very helpful to a mill. And so we basically gave them the vocabulary and trained them on what to say and how to communicate. And that was successful because we empowered the regions, and they had made investments in those people in those offices, so why not use it? And then we eventually, we not only, they had the color QC software, but we eventually bought color matching software and laptops for each one of them and trained them on how formulation and correction worked, so they could go around and kind of be the evangelists for implementing digital color management at the mills. Because what we saw at the time was a lot of mills would use formulation to get a color, but then they wouldn't make the correction using the software. They'd kind of do it by eye. And so they helped get that process out. So I stayed at Target for a while. We got the process pretty much under control. I went to Land's End for a couple of years working for a guy named Sid Mashburn, who I knew at Ralph Lauren, who's now a famous menswear designer in Atlanta. But it was a good experience because I was doing color materials there, but also involved back in design. So seeing that connection between the aesthetic and the manufacturing side. And then JCPenney, there was an opportunity to take color at JCPenney. And at the time, JCPenney was, they were a well-known brand, but their quality reputation was excellent. A lot of manuals, quality manuals around the world are based on JCPenney. And so I had the opportunity to, okay, let's look at color here. So we implemented digital color, had a great team there. But what I always thought was, rather than just digitizing and speeding up the process of them sending us a lab dip, why don't we actually look at what's going on in the mill? Because you can approve lab dips all day long, but then unless the production dyeing was of the same quality, what's the point? And so we came up with a program we call color accreditation program, and we spent months. A guy named Russ Merritt was our project manager, and he was a former Air Force guy, Black Ops. I mean, he was a project guy, and we were disciplined enough with his direction to actually think this thing through and figure out what the cap should be. We wrote a 50-page document talking about every step of the way, and then I had talked with Doug Bynum, who was at Chrome at the time, and told him what we were doing. He said, you should talk to these guys over in TIFIC. They're thinking about this. So we met with them. We showed them our plan. We said, we think this works. What it was basically we would evaluate the capability of a mill based on their lab and their die house to see just what their strengths and weaknesses were, and then if they met a certain level of capability, we'd basically say, you don't have to do lab dips. I just want to see what your production looks like. So based on some technology that Nativic developed, what they could do was understanding how a mill works. They dye a lot of fabric. It comes out of the dryer. It sits in load release for a while it conditions. Then they swatch it. They bring it into the testing lab. They do their fastness tests, all the internal tests that they're required just as a manufacturer. And then they evaluate it for shade. So most of the mills we were dealing with were measuring it on a spectrophotometer anyway. So we said, tell you what, you measure it, you store that measurement to a certain directory on your on your desktop, and then the Nativic technology basically uploaded that measurement to what we now call a cloud, but was just a remote database. And so it gave us instant visibility into every production lot that the mills are running. And so who cares what the lab dips look like as long as your production is consistent. And since we saw every production lot, we saw whether or not there was shading, from lot to lot. We had to sample each lot multiple times, so we saw if there was shading within a lot. And we had thought initially that the privileges that would go with the cap, maybe 20% of the mills could do it. What we found was 100% of the mills qualified. Once you told them what the expectation was, then it was actually a piece of cake. I remember we were at this mill in Korea, and I said, okay, show me what you do when a lot comes off the floor and you're evaluating it for acceptability. So they pulled a swatch out, they pulled the approved production sample out, they pulled their approved lab dip out, they pulled out their original physical color standard, and then they put them all on the table and they just kind of stood around and talked. And basically, if they could find one of them that matched, one of these standards, they'd ship. But it took, anywhere from a half hour to an hour to discuss this. And we said, well, I'll tell you what, if it matches our delta E tolerance in the primary illuminant and secondary illuminant, you can ship all day long. And they looked at me like I was from the moon or something. But that's what we set up. And basically it simplified the process at the mill. It took away the ambiguity. It clarified what they needed to do to succeed. And we basically just at JCPenney, we had to say that the standard is a standard is a standard. The standard doesn't change when you get in approved lab dip. It doesn't become the standard. The standard is what at this point in time, it was what our chroma standard was. So we did 7 mills in the pilot, and I remember presenting it to Peter McGrath, who is the head of sourcing and product development at JCPenney, and my boss at the time, he said, I don't know if Peter's going to buy this because of what it costs the mills, because there was a fee. I mean, there's a fee involved with cap that the mills pay. But so I put together a presentation, and we calculated the cost of lab dips and actually pulled data out of PLM system to show how much mills had been spending just shipping lab dips, forget about everything else. And, you know, so I'm into slide 1, and he looks at the numbers. He says, good to go. I said, what about the cost? He says, that's the cost of this program is pennies compared to what the mills are absorbing. And if the mills are absorbing costs, we're absorbing costs. So here again, it's this understanding of not just the price of the product, but the price of the process involved in getting to that product.
Right. Total cost.
Yeah. So we basically, we implemented that at Penny's. I got an opportunity to come to Under Armour after that, to work for Janet Fox, who had taken over sourcing there. And the challenge there was to move to, implement the cap. But whereas Penny's was predominantly a cotton product, Under Armour was, making all athletes better, and so it was performance textiles, which are mostly polyester. And at the time, they had a campaign that cotton was the enemy. So we had to look at, okay, can we move? Does this work for multiple substrates? And long story short, it did. And made the same presentation to the chief supply chain officer about, okay, this cap program, we can save lots of money internally. We can speed up our calendar. Literally, we took 3 months off the product development calendar. And so he saw the presentation, and he mandated that this was a program that every mill had to subscribe to. So we went from, I know there in the past, some places, they want to do a proof of concept, and maybe we'll just do this one product or maybe this one brand. But Jim Hardy, chief supply chain officer, he's jump in, man. He says, if this works, it works, and it worked. So we got to implement it. We got to see it impact the mills. And Under Armour, like most brands, had international vendor summits where they sit around and talk about how great the brand is, and then they talk about new policies, and then those vendor interactions. So we presented the cap at the vendor summit, but instead of me presenting it, I had two die house manager from 2 different mills present my program, because you're going to be more credible to this audience than I am.
Yeah.
And so one guy said, it's a great program, but these guys don't even know the value of their own product. They think it's just courier fees, but it's the real value is in production planning. That you don't have to worry about sitting around getting an approval. You can schedule your production based on what makes most sense at the mill, not color. So they loved it, and as is often the case, when a brand moves their sourcing around from region to region, for whatever reason, or when a product hits and they can't get enough fabric from one mill, they've got a multi-source. And in most cases, multi-sourcing is like, sourcing guys are slitting their wrists, because you're getting differences from fabrics from one region to the other. But with the cap, since everyone was uploading their production measurements to the cloud, we could see exactly who was producing what. And since in the cap, your ongoing rating is based on the accuracy and precision of your dyeings, everybody wanted to stay level 4 or above. So everyone was staying right in that cluster. So we literally, there was one program, we took fabric from 4 different dye houses, sent it to the same garment factory, and they were basically mixing lots and cutting it, and there was no shading within the garment. Wow. So that in my view, that proved the value of a digital process. Color is subjective, depending on, the most important thing about color is which colors you choose. If you choose ugly colors, it doesn't matter how well you replicate them, because they're not going to sell.
They're accurate though.
Yeah, exactly, deadly accurate. But the problem that we encountered at initially at JCPenney, and we continued to fight with at Under Armour, was, okay, what if there is a legitimate reason you can't match that color because of a particular substrate, or the dyes and the dyes you use in reactives versus dispersed dyes, you're getting unavoidable metamerism, or it's at a gamut. What do we do about that? Well, at Penny's, we hired a woman named Donna Faber who had extensive background in the dye industry, and this was, I mean, she loved this crap. I mean, she could figure out all of the technical issues and could advise mills on what to do. If they couldn't match, she'd say, "Well, try this dye combination." Generally, it worked, but not every brand has an expert like that. And when at Under Armour, we were basically taxing the technical resources at Natific, because the mills are just covering them up. So basically we said, what we really need to know up front is this color feasible? And in other words, can I match it? Can I have acceptable metamerism from one substrate to the other? Is it within the gamut of a dye class? And if I can match it, will I hit the fastness requirements of each of the fabrics and fiber types? So we challenged Natific and Andreas Roth and those guys came up with what they call voodoo. Swiss don't know how the hell to market their stuff. They come up with these silly ass names, but nonetheless, it was like voodoo in that it was like magic, and it actually worked. And I mean, I remember the first time they presented it to us, we had a palette of like, I don't know, 100 colors, something like that. And they ran it through the voodooizer, and they said, over half of your colors, you're going to have technical issues with. Either you're not going to be able to match them, or you're going to have fastness issues, so you're going to have to approve them off shade. And so then they did the correction. And what voodoo is, it basically takes your color into primary luminate. And first it says, can I match it under primary luminate? And then it takes, okay, can I match it in secondary luminate? And if you can't match it in secondary luminate, then it basically screws around with the shape of the curve. So the match is consistent in primary, maybe it moves to a different shade in secondary. So they basically, they came back with their corrections, and all but 2 colors, they corrected the standards so that the standards were matchable. And with the cap, that's the keystone to the whole idea, is the mill is evaluated based on how well it matches a digital standard. And so if you send them a standard that it's impossible to match for technical reasons, they're going to be outside of tolerance, their rating is going to drop, and they're going to be penalized. So it's not fair to them to change the rules. So voodooization, by modifying the standards, made it, gave a target that everybody could hit. And when you think about what they actually did, they were forecasting best can do's. Instead of waiting 3-4 submits and then pull them all out and see which one you can live with, they're basically saying this color will never be any better than this shade. And we did some evaluations after the fact, and sure enough, a lot of stuff that we had passed as best can do's in the past, once we compared it with the voodoo replacement standard, the best can do's actually matched that standard. So all we did was flip the process on its head. So you get rid of the exceptions, you deal with them at the beginning, and you ask the designer, can you live with this variant shade? And if they can, great. If they can't, then they change the color. So that became the whole idea behind digital color. And so meanwhile at Under Armour, I was managing a fabric team too, and a performance brand like Under Armour, when they're saying that they're making all athletes better, it's usually accomplished through the material. I mean, the colors make them feel good, and colors make them buy the garment, but it's the performance factors, wicking and heat retention, this kind of stuff, as a vehicle of fabric. So working with some guys, a lot of presence from NC State graduates on this team, and we started looking at fabric, and color's easy. I mean, quite frankly, I'm really surprised that in 2020 we don't have better adoption of digital color management across the industry. The way I see it, it's been done. There's a path there, and with COVID, perhaps it's the impetus, for some check writers to say, okay, we're going to follow this process for that. There was, as we implemented this program in the past, there was concern among some quarters, basically the color team, that, well, if you have digital color, then I'm going to lose my job. I mean, I really hate sitting in the light box, but at least it's a paycheck. And the way we looked at it was, we're eliminating a grunt work, tasks that nobody really wants to do. It's boring as heck. It's tedious, and we're gonna introduce a higher class of problem. So instead of looking at a lab dip, Marielle Newman, who was a colorist at Under Armour, she started looking at color analytics. She started evaluating the data in the color warehouse every day to look for trends, whether they were, if were colors going off shade, when we introduced a new color, did it introduce any technical problems? So all of a sudden, the colorist becomes a bigger value add to the team by looking at things that really impact the product that the customer is going to see. So I see the opportunity with digitalization and color is to add more value. And in times when it's proven that you don't need to be sitting in front of a light box or in an office, anything that you can add to your list of capabilities is going to keep you at the company or return you from furlough based on whatever the situation is. So, it's, there's value in that. So we can do it for color. So I started looking at fabric. I mean, fabric it's a set of variables. So the challenge was, could we do this for fabric? Could we digitize fabric? Could we create a QTX for fabric, not for the color that goes on the fabric, but for the fabric itself? And that's basically what I started working on right before I left Under Armour, and ultimately that's what I'm doing today.
That is really interesting, Keith. I mean, really, it's really neat to hear the timeline and the progression of thought and action, and even though it's it was over several years. So I think that's really great. So you're now at Black Swan Textiles, but I know that the concept of Black Swan is its own term, and I read everything about Nassim Nicholas Taleb that I want to know about. And but if you could explain that to us, I think that would be kind of an eye opener to the audience.
I first came across his Black Swan theory back, I think around 2010, 2011, something like that. It was a LinkedIn post. I mean, somebody said, "Oh, Black Swan," and I thought it was a cool name. So I have a design background, but so I read it, and basically, the Black Swan theory is that the major events, the major improvements or changes throughout history have been a result of what we'll say revolution, not evolution. They haven't been gradual changes that improve things like a developmental approach. They've been, kind of like comets hitting dinosaurs types of things that change the environment. And, so basically for a Black Swan event to be legit, it has to be based on something out of the ordinary, a crazy idea, or a pandemic, or crazy things like that. But in this case, I think that digital color was a Black Swan event because it was a crazy idea. All of a sudden, you didn't need to look at a swatch of color, and you could make a decision on it, and you could do it. You could do it anywhere in the world, and you could do it in vast numbers. So that was a crazy idea. And when we first implemented that back in the 90s, there were people saying, "Oh, no, that's sacred ground. You just don't do that." And so there was the resistance wasn't necessarily rational resistance. There weren't people saying that, "Oh, the delta E CMC equation is not as good as delta E 2000. And they weren't talking that. They're just saying it's basically heresy. So, but when we introduced it at Target, first our first approval rate skyrocketed. The mills basically acknowledged that working from a digital standard was better than working from a physical standard. So it quickly became acceptable and produced positive results. So we got the results that nobody thought you could get, and then it kind of becomes the new norm. And everybody said, "Oh yeah, I knew that." Well, as if, but it did take off, and it did become quite the topic in the early 2000s. You know, there wasn't an AATCC event where there wasn't, you know, a series of presentations on digital color, and it became a way for brands to improve their processes. It became a way for instrument companies to sell instruments and software and all this kind of stuff. So the reason it's called Black Swan is everybody knew that all swans were white. There was a Roman poet that wrote about an idea that was so stupid it was like a black swan. And then in 1697, black swan was discovered in Australia. So new facts undermine certainty. So I thought that was a cool name at the time, and we were moving through different changes, whether it was the internet or email or digital color. So I figured that's not a bad idea. And so when I interviewed at Under Armour for this color and material position, I said, you know, color's a piece of cake. I mean, it's kind of like Groundhog Day. What I'm really interested in doing is seeing if we can figure out a way to change how apparel is made and where apparel is made. And so I did a presentation that I called the third Black Swan. And first Black Swan was when we introduced digital color at Target. Second Black Swan was when we introduced CAP at JCPenney. And the third Black Swan was designing digitally and moving the apparel industry either back to the US or closer to where the products were being sold. And I pitched it to the co-founder of Under Armour, and he just looked at me and said, you know, you're crazy. This is this craziest thing I've ever heard. And then a week later, there was a meeting, a VP meeting, and Kevin Plant, KP, was talking to everybody, and he's talking about, you know, the positive impact of Under Armour, all this kind of stuff. And he says, you know, what if we could move apparel manufacturing back to the U.S. and what if we could impact people's jobs? And Kip Fulks, who I proposed it to, yells out, "Black Swan, baby!" And so I go, wow, that's pretty cool. And it took a year or so, but Under Armour eventually built the Lighthouse, which was a facility focused on advanced manufacturing and digitalization. And you know, that was kind of a high point, because you don't necessarily see ideas like that adopted very frequently. But I continue to believe that this is the biggest opportunity that we're going to see, and you know, we're actually, although it kind of sucks to live through COVID, we're living in a time that there is the opportunity to have a major impact on an industry. Apparel is $2.5 trillion in sales globally every year. In the U.S., it's roughly $330 billion in sales, and yet it is one of the most primitive industries out there as far as technology, especially at the garment factory. The
second oldest profession.
Yeah, well, something like that. The latest innovation in sewing was at the end of the 18th century, when they moved the hole from the top of the needle to the bottom of the needle, and they could use it in a sewing machine. And not much has changed in the sewing machine since then. So it was an opportunity to get moving along those lines. The Lighthouse had partners, industry partners who, you know, would participate in the development of this new technology. Siemens was one of them. And so when I left Under Armour in 2017 to start Black Swan, you know, I started talking to the folks that I had known through through the lighthouse and to see what their interest was in pursuing other areas. By that time, Lighthouse was focusing on footwear. Footwear is more of a rigid product, whereas fabrics are floppy and present certain problems for automation. But that's, first couple of years in Black Swan consulting on digital product creation. Digital product creation, 3D. You think about that, and everybody thinks that the output of 3D is a really cool rendering on a computer, and it is, but you make that 3D image the same way you make a real garment. You have to have a pattern set, the shape of the pieces that are cut and sewn together. You have to have a fabric, some type of representation of fabric, and you have to have color. So you have to have digital components for each of those three things. Color, piece of cake. All you got to do is plug in spectral data, and the mills, we've proven that the mills can work with that. The pattern files, they've convert to a format called DXF, which is kind of a generic format that can be imported into Gerber and Lectra and those systems. There are some issues with that as far as how much of the detail they retain, but those can be managed. But when it came down to it, you're looking at a bill of materials or a tech pack or whatever it is that a brand sends to a factory, and maybe they describe fabric as like a 5-ounce poly cotton fleece, or maybe they call it, a rustic this or that. So there's these design names, kind of like, the goofy color names that you and I have seen. And maybe they'll throw in, okay, it's a knit or it's a woven, and if it's a knit, maybe it's a jersey or interlock. But then all of a sudden you start getting these goofy names that are brand specific. And at the best you can hope for is if the brand is working with a particular mill, they're going to say, we're going to nominate this mill's fabric, and article number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. So they're pointing to a specific fabric. So as long as the garment factory buys that specific fabric, then it's good. But if you do your product development based on fabrics out of Asia, and all of a sudden you want to produce a garment in Central America, then you have to move, and replicating fabrics is harder than developing new fabrics. Developing new fabrics, you just churn until you see something you like. If I don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it or when I run out of time. But when you dual source or multi-source a fabric, those fabrics have to be the same. And not just they have to look the same at the point of inception, but they have to wear the same. So from a customer experience, if I've worn this garment, washed it 20 times, so I buy a new one, and all of a sudden the second time I wash this new one, it's pilling like crazy. Well, what's different? It's supposed to be the same fabric. So you really got to start digging down.
Push level.
Yeah. So basically we approach fabric like we approach color. What are the components of it? How do you combine those components, and how do you manage those components? So Black Swan is we're currently working on digitizing fabrics.
So, I mean, that would be, to me, that sounds like a massive database. And is that basically what it's kind of based on?
Yes and no. It starts with we have to get a collection of fabrics. We have to actually get the physical fabrics, and then we have to know how those fabrics are made. So we've partnered with Swisstex, a mill out in California, probably one of the best.
Very good one.
Yeah, one of the best that you'll come across. And they were super supportive when we implemented the cap, And so we went back there and said, we'd like digitized fabric. And so they're providing us fabric for analysis. And when we digitize a fabric, there's 6 things we're looking at. The first 2 are related. The appearance, the surface appearance of the fabric, not stripes or solid, just, what does the construction look like? So that construction appearance, and then actually what is the construction? So how does a mill actually make the fabric? So we're basically taking the actual appearance and figuring out what the correlation is to machine settings and yarn selection. So that's the first 2. The third attribute, hand. The first thing that you do, when you pick up that fabric, you pick it up and you feel it, and maybe it feels yummy, maybe it feels dry, maybe it feels slick. Who knows? I mean, somebody goof. There's worse words to describe hand there are for color, but at least color there are standardized words. I mean, red means red, and unless you have major issues, it's not green. Whereas hand, it's all over the map, and then you're trying to translate that to overseas, and it's a problem. And so it's a super important attribute. So we figure, well, if we can digitize color, we can digitize hand. The next one is drape. Drape needs to be digitized for the 3D programs to work. They create their physics files so that simulation of a fabric can fall over an avatar in a similar manner to how it actually falls over a human. So drape and hand are also closely related. In most other industries, they're treated the same, but we, in apparel, we split them apart. So we've identified a couple companies that are successfully digitizing hand and drape, either theoretically or to support other industries. They're in the paper industry. Before a producer can ship toilet paper to Costco, they have to measure a sample of that toilet paper on an instrument and upload those measurements to the cloud so that they can show that they're in compliance with that hand spec. And yeah, I mean, the way that paper feels is so important when you consider its end use, so to speak.
so to speak.
Yeah. So, we've demonstrated that other industries have solved this problem based on their requirements. So, how much of those models are transferable over to textiles? So we're looking at that now. The next attribute, performance, the typical testing that you do at Intertech or BV. But rather than testing just for the requirements of the category that fabric's going into, we have a protocol of tests that cover most end uses. So we want to characterize a fabric so I can search against a fabric database and say, show me all the fabrics that are suitable for yoga pants. So there's probably there'll be an opacity measurement in there so that the yoga people aren't embarrassed. Or if it's for a football jersey, you don't want the jersey ripping in the middle of a play on national TV. So there are test methods already in place around this stuff. So we want to characterize a fabric. The story I keep thinking of is the original Under Armour tight shirt was actually made out of fabric that had traditionally been for lingerie. And had you gone by the conventional wisdom, you're not going to use a lingerie fabric for a macho garment, but the fabric didn't know that it was just for lingerie. So basically, you look at it for end use, and it's a digital specification. And finally, the last attribute, manufacturing feasibility. That's data that you pull out of a machine that tracks knitting speed or tracks defects per 1,000 yards, so that we're actually pulling data out of the machine that gives us some insight into how complex it is to make a fabric. Today, that metric really doesn't exist, except in the minds of some guys at the mill. But in essence, we want to make that data available so that when someone is determining what fabric to use, they're looking at more than just cost and more just logistics. What is the total performance we're looking at? If there was a fabric that we replicated one time to get rid of a yarn problem, and so we came up with, we created the fabric with some different yarns, but it turns out that the machine that the fabric was created on was a much slower knitting machine than the old one. So we traded one obstacle for another. And so if you have insight into this, basically the feasibility metric is kind of a red, yellow, green thing. And then you can dig into it, say, okay, what makes this red or what makes this yellow? And it'll say it's knitting speed or it's quality, repeatability, this kind of stuff. So these are basically 6 attributes that we're looking at. So right now, a product called M2K. And what M2K does is it provides a recipe to make a circular knit. If you look at circular knitting machines, which the majority of knits are produced on, you've got flat knitting machines that are electronic, that are driven by software, and then you have circular knitting machines that were invented in the 19th century, and they look surprisingly the same today that they did then. And when you set up a circular knitting machine, there's a guy with an Allen wrench and some tools, and he's moving cams and dials around, because it's a mechanical device. These pieces direct where the needles and the yarn go when it's creating fabric, and it takes basically 30 hours to set up a machine. And so when a brand is working with a mill, the mill isn't just working on a piece of lab equipment like they are in color. They're actually working on a production machine, and they're basically taking that machine out of commission to do this development. It could take up to 5 iterations. And when you factor in the time it takes just to set the machine up and then do the knitting and evaluate it and then put it in the mail and blah, 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 you're talking about months of time. And it's expensive time, because that machine, if it were available for production, would be generating revenue instead of a liability. So the thing is, this is kind of a disruptive technology, because if you go out today, fabric is kind of magic. I mean, there's each technician, with years of experience, he gets a fabric to analyze. He'll pull out his pick glass or maybe put it under a microscope, and he'll look at the loop structure, and he'll count courses and wales and do all those kinds of calculations, and he'll scribble down notes on how to, symbols that represent how to set up a machine. And maybe he's right, maybe he's close, maybe it's his best guess, but chances are you send the same fabric to multiple mills, you're going to get multiple recipes. So what M2K does is basically we take an image of a circular knit front and back, we run it through an algorithm, and it spits out the diagram of how to set up that machine, and it gives you a yarn specification, and like in seconds. So this is the equivalent of a spectrophotometer in essence, that it spits out an objective definition. And it's a recipe that if you're going to multi-source, you can send the digital recipe up to multiple mills. They don't have to go through the development. As long as they follow your instructions, then you're going to get equivalent fabric. And we have done some trials that we've sent the same recipe without a header card, without any swatches, to various mills and say, make this fabric, and it came back, and voila. So
that's what I was going to ask. I didn't want to ask a gotcha question, but I was going to ask if you tried that.
Yeah, and basically it's going to be a very harsh test when we get to the commercialization stage of M2K, because the way we'll prove it is we'll go to a mill, say, show me a fabric, and it's a fabric that they know how they make, and we're going to basically scan it, and we're going to say it's made this way, and we're either right or wrong. Now, one of the things that you got to watch out for, I mean, it's true in color, and it's certainly true in fabric. If a mill sends out a fabric to a brand and they put information about how this fabric made, it's probably wrong.
Yeah,
it's probably wrong for a reason, because they don't want people knocking them off.
Right. It wasn't really 26 singles cotton, you know.
Exactly. Just like that dye recipe is not really what I say
Yeah.
either. So there's a certain amount um, of peeking behind the veil, and here's what's really going on, and some people will be threatened by this, but here again, think of what the opportunity is. If there's a means to digitize a mill's fabric library, and mills have libraries of thousands of fabrics that they've developed, either production fabrics or stuff that they produce for fabric fairs or whatever, and they're sitting in a room somewhere, and they've done their best to try to organize them, but it's hard to organize a multi-dimensional fabric in an analog process. We've heard this from the mills themselves. They know that they'll get a new fabric to develop, and somebody will say, oh yeah, I remember doing something like that. They just can't find it, so they start over. So if every fabric they've created is digitized, then basically it becomes searchable. Just I can do a color search. I measure in red and I look at the Pantone library, and sure enough, here's 5 closest colors. It's the same idea. Whether you're searching for an exact fabric match, or you're searching for maybe 3 of the 4 attributes, or maybe the only thing you're interested in is, I want a signature hand for all of my shirts. And hand is such a subjective thing. How do you get the hand of a polyester to match that of a cotton? Well, you reduce it to numbers. So you can start doing fabric development by signature attributes like hand. Or maybe you're going to use multiple fabrics in a garment. You want them to drape similarly. So rather than just kind of guessing and crossing your fingers, you can actually search for fabrics that meet those requirements. So there's certainly, we've heard from the mills, we'd love to be able to do this because we want to be able to analyze our libraries. And if you can digitize a library, then it becomes an online menu. Because if they can search their own library, then they can give rights to brands to search their libraries. When they're trying to replicate a fabric because of CSR issues somewhere in the world, or they're trying to, they have a program, they want to move, they want to reshore. Well, how do we communicate the specs to the mills in this region? So, this becomes, it's a selling tool. A fabric library today is a liability because of all the costs that's gone into it. This allows them to monetize this, sell off of it, and basically they can limit the exposure. I mean, certain fabrics maybe they develop with a premier brand that they don't want the rest of the world to know about. They don't put them in there. So that's our second product, the Arsenal. It's a digital library of fabrics that serves both the needs of the brand and of the mill. And one last thing on that, when I was at Under Armour, we were doing color palette consolidation. There were too many colors in the palette in a given season. And there's all kinds of tools to do that. You can bring in the entire palette, you can plot it in color space, you can start looking for, minimum delta E and this kind of stuff. And so we could do palette consolidation all day long. And so the fabric guys were looking down their nose at the color team thinking, oh, you guys, too many colors. So I said, okay, number 1 selling color at Under Armour, black. How many fabrics was that on in one season? Well, it was a ridiculously high number. So
sure,
you want to consolidate all your materials, and if there are this X number of fabrics that are truly distinguishable to the customer, or that carry some feature with them, fine. But I doubt it. And there's all kinds of advantages of consolidating fabrics, from pricing considerations to logistics and availability and all this kind of stuff. So basically, you're pulling the same levers to manage fabric digitally that we use to manage color.
Yep. It's interesting. It's really just an outgrowth of like specification sheets, and just how much specification do you put into it, and if you put enough into it, you can duplicate the fabric.
Right.
So that's fascinating. And Keith, I got to tell you, that was the easiest interview I've ever done because I didn't ask any questions. All you did was tell us about things, and that's great. That's great. I mean, it was really fascinating. I got to tell you, really interesting stuff.
Cool.
I'm gonna look here to see if there's any questions from the Facebook crowd. I don't know if there are. I never told people that they could do it, so then we might get some questions later on, and I can send them. I could forward them to you.
Sure.
But just a great conversation. I really enjoyed that, Keith. That was great.
Well, and here again, everything we're doing today is based on what I learned in color. So I always used to say color is the most important thing in the world. I'll continue to say that. You got to have a fabric to put it on, but nevertheless,
right.
It's the big deal. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said, and I probably heard you say it before, but that, you know, it's easy. It's been done already, and we're still kind of reinventing the wheel all the time. You know, certainly, okay, some people might not be ready to be all digital, but, you know, some kind of homogenization between, you know, physical and digital is possible for anybody.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it validates, you know, what your eyes see. And
you know, Mitch, the thing is, right now, everybody's been talking about speed for years now, but they're serious about it now. You know, having and plus with a pandemic, it proves that certain things can be done differently. So, you know, this will be an enabling event that all of a sudden, you know, you start looking at technology, and there may be an initial investment in the technology, but you look at the long-term payoff, and it allows you to profit, and it gets rid of the whole problem of forecasting 12 months out. Because if you can actually go from design to product in store in a few weeks, that's game changer. So what we're looking at, the final aspect of this is, okay, fabric is a component of a garment. So what's a better way to design a garment? Today, all of the products out there start with a 2D pattern. So the way a factory works, because they're building a garment, they make a 2D pattern, and then they make a proto, and then they make adjustments based on looking at proto. So that's basically how the software is modeled. So it's difficult to transition. A creative designer who's been working in Illustrator or hand sketching, whatever, all of a sudden they've got to start thinking in terms of 2D patterns, and they have to learn this technology that at the end of the day is pretty cool, but it's a barrier to adoption because it is such a high jump. So we're looking at software that you don't start with patterns. You basically start with a bag over an avatar or something like it. And then by using some super interactive tools, you start tapering, you're sculpting what that garment looks like. You're not really worried about the fabric yet. You're looking about what is that garment going to look like? And it's a super interactive, intuitive thing. And then you start messing around with the drape of the fabric. So, you know, with some sliders, you can make it heavier or lighter or whatever. And at some point, you're applying texture. You say, I love it. You click approve. It generates a 2D pattern set. It doesn't start with it. It finishes with it. So start designing, end with a spec. And then you take the draping, you know, while you've been adjusting the drapes, you're adjusting numbers in the background. I mean, you don't know it, but numbers are changing. And it basically looks up, it goes to the arsenal, to the digital fabric library, and it identifies a fabric that meets those requirements. And so basically you end up with a fabric instead of starting with one. Right. So from a point of view of supporting how a designer works, it's a much better tool. And I think that what digitalization is going to change is in the old world, the big brands had the advantage because they had sourcing offices overseas and they had teams of people who could track stuff in spreadsheets and they could do all this crap. And the little guys were stuck. They could only use fabrics with minimum order quantities of X, and they couldn't get into the good factories. Well, if everything's driven by spec, and if you're using a software, which is in essence a product digital twin, if you're able to model that fabric, not only the way it looks, but what its components are and the costing of it, then you actually have a spec that is at least as good, if not better, than most brands send out today. And you can go to a factory. There are ways that you can get around MOQs based on insight. If you're searching a mill's library and you're specifying, okay, I like that fabric, maybe that fabric is scheduled for a production run in the next week, so you can just add on yards to an existing order. So this brings up all kinds of opportunities. The inventor of this new software, her name's Andrea Quake, she likens the advent of this technology to, in terms of evolution, that there was this Cambrian explosion where certain things changed in evolution and life took off. And so literally that's what's happening here. I mean, this isn't just about shortening lead time or getting rid of protos. This is about all kinds of business opportunities for apparel that people aren't even thinking about today. So it's kind of cool to be, in on the ground floor of this and seeing what happens.
I could see how excited you are and how exciting it could be.
So basically, we're gonna jumble two different concepts here. We have a Cambrian explosion through intelligent design. So it's
yeah. I think the piece that you're going to have to get through is that designers fear that they're going to lose their their ability to design, that it's all going to be numbers and whatnot. It's not that way. And color has proven that out. It really doesn't take away anybody's creativity. It makes it happen, really.
That we've heard that over and over again. And when you think about it, there's a certain element of truth in that in the current system, because if I have to start my design based on an existing design, then that kind of takes the creativity out. Basically, I'm reconfiguring an existing style. So that's the process that the current technology supports, and actually not a bad process in some cases, because stuff at the outlets or whatever, they drive a lot of revenue for brands regardless of product grade.
Yeah.
So, but if you can introduce another means to design that's going to push the design element forward and give the ability to designer not to be stuck in reconfiguring, but actually imagining new stuff, I think that's what's going to take off and lead to kind of a new renaissance using digitalization.
I'm just checking to see if there was any questions on Facebook. No, I think I'm going to wrap it up then.
Cool.
Keith, again, that was fascinating. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody listening did too. So I really thank you, and I really thank you for your time and all the effort that you put into it. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for the forum, Mitch. I appreciate being included.
That was great. I appreciate it. Thanks, Keith. Take care.
All right. See ya.
Be well. Bye-bye.